Second, language acquisition. As we'll talk about the process of language acquisition, we should differentiate between first language acquisition and second language acquisition. First language acquisition refers to the acquisition of native language, while second language acquisition refers to the acquisition of another language after the native one. Also, we should draw a line between second language and foreign language here as well. Second language is a language different than the native one, but it is used in the setting where we live, while foreign language is the language taught in schools and formal setting. After explaining terms related to language acquisition, let's start talking about first language acquisition. Here, there is a table of the theories of language acquisition according to different perspectives. There are three main perspectives: behaviorist, innatist, and interactionist. Basically, behaviorist perspective focuses on the utterances of the child and regards social environment as the primary source of language acquisition. Innatist perspective focuses on the child's sentence formation and regards the child as the primary source of language acquisition. And finally, interactionist perspective focuses on the conversation between the caregiver and the child. Regards this interaction as the primary source of language acquisition. When we ask the question, how do children learn a language? Different perspectives put forward different ideas. Behaviorism claims that we learn it through imitation, reinforcement, and structured input. The innatist perspective thinks that the ability to learn a language is innate. We are born with it. Conversely, connectionism claims there is no storage of information. Neuron connections provide everything we know. Social interactionist theory thinks that there are many factors that affect it. Finally, output hypothesis asserts that we learn it best through producing the language. First, we notice and make a hypothesis about the language, and then we produce our own language. Other than how it is acquired, it is also important to discuss here how language acquisition develops. Chomsky constructed a notion regarding the topic, which is called Language Acquisition Device, or LAD, in 1950. He asserted that every child around the world acquire a language more or less in a similar way and go through the same stages. These stages are perception of the speech, which starts from 26 weeks onwards while the baby is still in the womb. The child perceives the language even before being born. However, the next stage, babbling, occurs at least 6 months after the baby is born, and it takes the child to produce the first words approximately after 12 months. After the words are constructed, the child starts to talk in telegraphic speech, which means one word at a time. Then, grammar starts to develop, and more complex sentences are formed as the child grows. In addition to these stages, it is also important to talk about the acquisition order of the components of the language. There are 4 stages in total, and they are the acquisition of morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, respectively. First, the child starts to talk at word level, which means uses only words to communicate. Next, starts to make sentences with these words, and thus learns how to order words appropriately, according to the language being learned. Then, after reaching a certain age, the child starts to make more meaning of the sentences and may generalize some words in this stage. For example, if the child learns that ball is something round, as he may call everything round ball, and this is called overextension. On the contrary, for example, if the child learns the word cat at home and only calls their pet as cat and does not do so for the other cats, it is called underextension. Finally, after the acquisition of other components, the child acquires pragmatics, which means learns when and where to say things appropriately. At this point, the child differentiates between the contexts. As we mentioned earlier, the child acquires the language in a definite order. First, the child starts babbling as a baby. Babbling may also be called prelinguistic or cooing stage. There is no actual speaking at this stage, but the child gets ready to speak by combining vowels and consonants the child starts producing single words. This stage is also called one-word stage or holophrase stage, and as the name suggests, the child produces one word at a time and talks through single words. After the child starts to produce words, motherese intervenes. Motherese actually intervenes until this stage as well. It is a special infant-directed way of talking, and it has some distinctive features such as high pitch, exaggerated intonation, repetition of words, etc. It is not the regular talk, but used for the children by caretakers. The next stages for the child are producing 2 and more words respectively. As the child gets older, she or he starts to learn more and more vocabulary items and produces more complex sentences. As mentioned earlier, the stages that the child goes through while acquiring a language seem similar in all countries, regardless of the language, which also supports the idea of universal grammar. Universal grammar asserts there is a system that all languages share, and the ability to learn a language is innate, as the innate hypothesis confirms. According to innate hypothesis, human beings are endowed with language, and that there are specific mechanisms and parts in our minds for that. Chomsky put forward a mechanism in 1950 he called language acquisition device, which also suggests that every child is born with the mental capacity to learn and produce languages. According to language acquisition device, there are some parameters which appear early in language acquisition and may vary, such as the order of words. Also, there are some principles which appear later and do not vary, such as all languages having verbs. After talking about how we acquire the first language, let's talk a bit about learning the second or more languages. However, before we dive into the topics, there are some words that need explaining. Bilingualism means knowing more than one language, mostly 2 languages, while multilingualism means knowing more than 2 languages. At this point, we need to clarify the different subcategories of bilingualism. It is divided into 2 main and 4 subcategories, depending on the time of learning and the dominance of one of the languages. Regarding the time of learning, it can be either sequential or simultaneous bilingualism. Sequential bilingualism means learning a second language after acquiring the first one, while simultaneous bilingualism means learning or acquiring the first and the second languages concurrently. Regarding the dominance of the languages, it can be either subtractive or additive bilingualism. Subtractive bilingualism means due to learning of a second language, the first language detriments and is delayed, while additive bilingualism means both languages are equally used and valued. Of course, as we've just mentioned, learning 2 or more languages has some effects on the learner. For example, people who speak at least 2 languages tend to code mix or code switch, which means switching between the languages often. Also, according to fundamental difference hypothesis, second language acquisition is different from first language acquisition, because now we have a language to reach conclusions to and get help from. However, while learning our first language, we only have universal grammar. After learning a second language, we tend to construct our interlanguage grammar, which carries the aspects of both first and second language. Also, it is claimed that people who know more than a language tend to be better at problem solving and have better real-life skills, as they now know how to overcome a difficulty to some degree. Now, let's talk about second language acquisition. It is usually easier than acquiring the first language now that we have a language at hand to help us. However, it is also important to note that the languages sometimes affect one another negatively as well. For example, transfer, which means the interference of the first language to the second language due to similarities of differences between languages, may be negative as well as positive. Positive transfer refers to the acquisition of the first language, helps the acquisition of the second language, while negative transfer refers to vice versa. In negative transfer, first language that is acquired slows down learning a second language. Also, again, due to the first language, fossilization may take place. It means learning a word incorrectly, which is difficult or even impossible to change by the learner. There is another point that worth mentioning, which is critical period hypothesis, sometimes also called sensitive period hypothesis, and means there is a certain period where the language must be acquired. After that period, the language may not be acquired successfully, if not at all. Other than these hypotheses, there are some other hypotheses that were put forward by Krashen through his studies in 1970s. The first one is acquisition learning hypothesis, which differentiates acquisition from learning. According to this view, acquisition is subconscious, while learning is done consciously. The second one is the monitor hypothesis, which claims that learners can devise and make changes to their own learning. The third one is the natural order hypothesis, which asserts learning occurs in a predictable order. For example, we cannot expect a child to make sentences before learning the words yet. And the last one is the input hypothesis, which states we need comprehensible input to learn. Also, the input should be +1 from what we already know, meaning it should not be as the same level of difficulty. According to this hypothesis, it is also important to have a low effective filter to learn in a more relaxed and calm way. If the effective filter is high, the learner tends to feel uneasiness, and thus learning may not occur. The effective filter may act as the mental block of acquisition. Learners sometimes use some strategies to overcome the difficulties they face while learning a second language, and these strategies are called communication strategies. Such strategies are as follows. Avoidance means they avoid talking. Reduction means they keep their talking short. Message abandonment means they decide not to say what they want to say. And topic avoidance means they do not want to talk about certain topics if they do not know the related words. Also, sometimes they follow alternative plans instead of abandoning altogether, such as circumlocution, which means exemplifying what they want to say. Approximation, which means using an alternative term instead of the want that is wanted to be used. They may also use all-purpose words such as thing for all objects, coin, some new words, although they do not exist. Use non-linguistic means, such as body language. Translate the word from their mother language word by word, and sometimes even try foreignizing, which means adjusting a word in their first language to the second language. By making use of the strategies mentioned here, the learners try to communicate and convey their message to other people.
This is why we'll stop because we haven't talked about the so far. Any questions? Anything you say?